Israel has been accused of ethnic cleansing against Palestinians in the occupied West Bank. This follows an increase in the destruction of Palestinian houses and buildings in the area. The demolition work is clearing the land in order to prepare it for further Israeli settlements.
The area covers 360,000 hectares, equivalent to 60% of the West Bank. The demolitions have alarmed world diplomats and human rights groups, which say the Tel Aviv regime continues to violate international law. The UN says reconstruction aid to more than 1,350 Gazan families was suspended after Israel blocked private imports of cement, adding to a blockade enforced since 2007. Meanwhile, Israel accuses the Palestinian resistance movement Hamas for diverting the supplies.
How many Israelis live in settlements on Palestinian land? Why can Israel stop Palestinians rebuilding their homes? And what pressure should Britain put on Israel? These are the simple questions we sought to answer. Now, an Israeli lawmaker accused Israel of ethnic cleansing against Palestinians following a sharp rise in illegal demolitions of Palestinian houses. Why don't more British lawmakers express the same view? We asked the public.
That's a very interesting question, actually. I don't think, because in the UK, I think we're just basically they just concentrate with their own political and probably their own home affairs and everything. That's why nobody sat down to talk about this subject clearly. But there was a lot of debates about it. If you look in one of the programs, like The Big Question or with Andrew Marr, you get these sometimes, but it's not like a full debate because I think people are engaged in other things. That's just what I think.
Well, it's true that they don't make much of it here. On the whole, the government's favourable to Israel, and so is most of our press, right-wing press, so evidently it's not going to be talked about very much. But I do think it's a kind of ethnic cleansing, so I agree with that person in Israel.
It's a very complex issue. Israel is very closely tied to America, the USA that is, which we have that special relationship with. And to jeopardise that would perhaps be dangerous for us politically, economically, whatever. And also, it's a monumental thing to admit to. And governments are generally risk averse, I think. And to just come out and say, oh yeah, genocide Israel, then it would short term probably cause a load more trouble for those individual politicians and governments at the time, short term, than it would solve. But long term, obviously, someone's got to say it.
It's a very good question because it's an awful thing to happen. And actually, it sounds really stupid, I don't know why it's not discussed. I'd imagine there's some inbuilt resistance in the media, is what I would assume.
Might be something to do with the special relationship with the US, where there's a lot of Jewish people in America and votes are important, and we wouldn't want to unnecessarily upset our American cousins, basically.
I really don't understand it either, because I am very wary when I go to shops. I don't buy anything that is Israeli. Being South African, I kind of know how the South African government was punished by people not buying South African goods, and I almost feel incensed when I go into shops like Waitrose or M&S and they stocking products from Israel. We should really be boycotting Israel until they stop all of this nonsense.
Why don't more British lawmakers comment on the illegal demolition of Palestinian houses? We put this to our experts.
The reason it's not talked about is because the Israel lobby, and I say the Israeli lobby, not the Jewish lobby as many people wrongly state it. Israel is a tiny country in the Middle East. It occupies a tiny piece of land, and yet in the media and in mainstream politics here and in the US, politicians feel that they cannot criticize Israel, and that furthermore they must cozy up to the Israeli lobby to seek power. It's a very controversial issue, it's a very sensitive issue, but in my opinion people need to think about this question in terms of international law and in terms of human rights and in terms of historical facts. This is colonialism. Let's make no mistake about it.
Well, there's a very strong Zionist lobby in this country. It's not as strong as in America, but there's next to nothing to like anti-Zionist lobby within the British government, within high positions. So it's very hard to combat this, and people feel that their careers can be finished just for combating Zionism. There's also the fear of being called anti-Semitic. This in itself is an anti-Semitic argument, as basically what we're talking about is a murdering, ethnic cleansing ideology that's killing Arabs for being Arabs. Arabs are Semites. So if speaking out against that is anti-Semitic, it's basically saying that an Arab being treated like a human being is anti-Semitic, is offensive to Jews, that they would be equals. It's also anti-Semitic in the way that I'm not an expert on Judaism as a religion, but I've had conversations with some of my practicing friends who have told me that Judaism, like Islam or Christianity, is a religion of peace. It doesn't support ethnic cleansing, it doesn't support genocide, it doesn't support racism and apartheid.
Israel's demolition of Palestinian homes in the West Bank is to prepare for Israelis to settle there in the future. How do you feel about Israel's forced transportation of Palestinians out of their homes? That's what we asked the public.
Yeah, I've been out there. So I've been into the West Bank, I've been to Israel. I've seen some of the things that go on. I mean, some of the settlements vary as well. So you've got the new builds that are basically expanding throughout the West Bank, and then you've got the old settlements and the urban areas, places like Hebron. So I've been to Hebron. I've been to, I've actually, been out into the desert as well. So the Judean desert, and I've seen it going on, and it's pretty bad.
I feel that it's completely unfair, and it's, as from what little I know about it, it's not just forcing them off their land and the farmers they have been farming for many, many generations. It's also removing their water rights, as I understand. It's just ghastly.
I mean, they're more powerful. They've got a lot of... I think America backs them rather, actually, anyway. And it makes them feel much stronger to do exactly as they wish. And really, they're just not being fair to the Palestinians, when the Palestinians really had the land and always have had the land.
I think it's quite upsetting. It would be nice to see greater balance. There's right and wrong on both sides, and I think that balance is not well represented in the media, and people don't get the opportunity to discuss these things openly.
Personally, I find that really difficult. I mean, that's no different. The way I look at it is, I live down on the south coast. It's like someone trying to move me out of my house in Eastbourne because they want a bit of my land and shove me across into Hastings. No, absolutely not. That's the way I kind of look at it, and that's probably very simplistic, but I think it's outrageous. I think it's really difficult. There must be better ways of actually establishing a conversation between both sides. Yes, I understand all the political implications around that. I understand why that's happened. This has been going for years and years and years, but there has to be a better solution. The bloodshed out there is horrific. Again, children affected, families affected, people trying to get away from there. How can that be fair? How can that be fair, taking away what is rightfully theirs, I believe. Politically, some people might not agree with that, but actually taking that away from them is no different to trying doing something like that here. And I find that really harsh. There has to be better ways in establishing a way forward to deal with that.
How do I feel about anybody being forced to do anything? I think the people who are being forced are people who have no choice. They have no option. So really, you pick on the weakest, don't you? And in society, and especially over there, the society means that the higher up the chain you are, the more influence you have. So I think the people at the bottom of the chain are the ones who are suffering now, and most probably, unfortunately, will always suffer.
Well, it's ethnic cleansing, essentially, isn't it? I don't think I need to say much more.
How do our experts react to Israel's forced transportation of Palestinians from their own homes?
The reason lawmakers don't want to talk about Israel, the occupation of land illegally and the demolition of more and more homes is because the Israeli lobby has an acute and very specific stranglehold on the UK media and UK politics. You cannot criticise the state of Israel if you have political aspirations in the UK. You cannot criticise Israel if you want to get anywhere in the mainstream media. And that's the state of play that we currently see now.
Right now, there's a lot we keep hearing reports as if about Palestinians being removed from their homes. These reports seem like isolated incidents or some new development. This is nothing new. This is how Israel was created. This is how Israel has continued to exist since its creation. I think if we're going to understand anything in the Holy Land and of the situation there, we have to respect the 70 years of history. You can't just look at what's happened the last 5 years, the last 10 years and say, otherwise it's very easy to paint Palestine, why are they so angry, what's their problem, why, you know. If you don't understand why they're angry and you don't look into the history, then you'll never understand the problem.
Next, we found out if the public were aware of how many Israelis already live in settlements on Palestinian land, built since the 1967 occupation of the West Bank, and how they feel about this. The answer's 500,000, by the way.
I don't have a guess because I don't have the statistics at my fingertips, but I'd say between 200,000 and 300,000.
It's over 500,000. How do you feel about that?
Well, I'm not surprised. I'm not as surprised at all that it's over 500,000. I think it's disgraceful.
800,000 to a million.
Good guess, just over 500,000, right ballpark. How do you feel about that number?
It's an awful lot when there's no international consensus. Clearly, the people who already occupy the area are being disadvantaged. And again, I think it comes down to poor or lack of equality.
50,000? Maybe a bit, I don't know. Yeah, 50,000, I would say.
It's just over 500,000. How do you feel about that?
Wow. No, that's scary. It's scary that they've been uprooted themselves as well, and that it's caused disruption not just to them but to everyone around them. No, it's scary, and I wish I knew more about it. And I'll probably read about it again.
15,000.
How do you feel about the fact the answer is just over 500,000?
Wow. Yeah, well, there you go. Yeah, a lot bigger problem. I reckon most people would probably guess below that.
You've put me on the spot. I would not realistically have a clue. I'd probably way out here. It's probably, I don't know, 300,000 or 400,000, maybe something like that. That's a real pie in the sky thinking. Answer's probably totally wrong, but yeah, I don't know, but I should imagine it's substantial.
Good guess, just over 500,000. How do you feel about that? Well done, by the way.
How do I feel about that? Again, like I said earlier, I think to your initial question, for me, I find that really untenable. I think that's disgraceful. I think it's difficult.
How do our experts feel about the 500,000 plus Israelis who live in settlements built since the 1967 occupation on Palestinian land?
Again, if we want to talk about colonialism, it says something about the current state of play of so-called democracy, where you can be born in New York, in the United States of America. You could have converted to Judaism yesterday, and yet you have more right to go and live in Palestine than the indigenous people that were born there going back many, many, many decades. So it's another aspect of Israel's policy of ethnic cleansing. They want all the Palestinians gone from Palestinian land. And furthermore, actually, Israel's very worried because demographically the Palestinians are reproducing at a much faster rate than Israel. So again, that's probably another reason why they're so desperate to get as many Israelis in the Holy Land as possible.
When looking at the Israelis living in illegal settlements in Palestine, of course, for most people with a sense, Israel itself is just an illegal settlement in Palestine. But it is something that's not new even in the last 70 years. If you look at how the United States was built, they built these settlements around Indian villages until they could take over nations, exactly how it's been done in Palestine. If you look at the histories in Australia, New Zealand, very similar. And we can take it further back, and some people might be uncomfortable with this, hearing this, but if you look at the English when they came to Britain, and took over the land of the native Celtic people who were living here. They were doing the same thing. They were building their colonies around And so it's something that's got its roots in British Germanic culture, and that needs to be taken out because it's never ended. It's sort of the same in South Africa. They attempted the same thing. So it's something that we need to look at as part of a culture of violence and settler colonies.
The UN says 1,350 Palestinian families won't be able to reconstruct their homes following Israel's bombings, as Israel has blocked the import of cement into Gaza. Why is Israel free to treat innocent families in this way? The public said this.
Because of the backing from the US. I think there are too many people in the US with money supporting Israel and nobody standing up for the Palestinians. It's just unbelievable again that they get away with it.
Because of American support. It's a simple answer. Israel can do what it likes as long as they have the unconditional support of both parties in the United States. And to some extent, of course, support from European governments. There's really no other answer to it.
I don't know, because they walk with impunity. You know, they essentially can do what they want because the West allows them to do it. In my opinion, it's disgraceful. It's disgraceful not only on the Israeli side, but on the West side, of the way in which we do close our eyes to it, or we turn a blind eye to it.
Because they're solely in charge. There's nothing else to it. They prevent the rebuilding of the Palestinian airport. I think they prevent import. There must be a harbour somewhere that I'm sure that they prevent stuff coming in. And they basically are treating the, I won't say the West Bank, no, the Gaza Strip as, I hate to say it, as a ghetto.
Well, they have the power. If you have the backing of America, they're in a very comfortable position for their own ends. But they're very unfair people. I distrust them. They're selfish.
Because they make the rules. And they have the power.
Can our experts explain Israel's apparent ability to stop Palestinians from rebuilding their homes?
I think it's a complicated question and we'd be here all day. But fundamentally, Israel has a stranglehold on the economy, the political system in Palestine, and anything and everything which can go in and out of Palestine. And so, again, what you're seeing, this is just part of the prolonged effort to just submerge any form of Palestinian resistance, any form of Palestinian mobilization, any form of Palestinian political activity, any form of unity actually. It's part of the effort to just divide and rule. If the people are divided, they're less likely to be able to fight the occupying force.
The only real power, I think, legally that would be able to intervene is the UN in the treatment of Palestinians by the Israelis. The problem is that the nation that usually defies the UN and that actually can go against law in order to intervene is the US. But it's the US is actually the one that's doing the opposite in the case of Palestine, in keeping the other countries from, or the UN from, being able to intervene, using their veto to stop any sort of action being taken against Israel. So I think the US is basically the main cause, and maybe to be a bit more generous to them, we could say Britain and France and the West on the whole have a role to play in that as well.
More and more people in Britain seem to be fighting for democracy in Israel towards Palestine. What pressure does the public feel the British government should put on Israel?
I think as consumers we could start by boycotting Israel, by not buying their products, and even pressurising supermarket groups to say do not buy their products because we won't support your businesses. And I think lobbying our MPs to do something on our behalf to help the Palestinians.
I think the first thing is to raise awareness. And people just to say it's unacceptable.
I would want to see more people talking about it. I mean, this is great. It's being asked about. It shows how little I know, to be perfectly honest. I think it just needs to be more talked about more openly. And I think instead of the government officials making their stance on it. They need to take in what the public has to say, because I know a couple of people may feel quite strongly about people coming into the country, but it is what it is, and you've got to, at the end of the day, it's mankind, not everyone for themselves. So I think people need to look at it from that perspective as well.
Don't let Tony Blair do it. That's one thing. Don't let him anywhere near it. Don't let him near anything, really. But it's not only up to us, it's up to the whole community of all the world, especially the United States. They've got a load of influence there. They could easy come to an agreement with these Israelis and the Palestinians about what they can do.
I think you'd really look at trade. You'd have to bring it out into a wider forum, bring other superpowers around the world involved as well. I don't think it's something you can do in isolation, but I think first you hit their trade and then you hit their commerce and see where you're going from there. But I think it takes a collective rather than an individual.
I think if they were more overtly involved in the process in order to see fairness, I think that would help.
What pressure would our experts like to see Britain exert on Israel in support of democracy in Palestine?
I'd like to see more pressure along the lines of democratic movements like the BDS movement. I think we need to hit Israel and the supporters of the State of Israel in their pockets. I think we, the public, and this is what I'd really stress to people, we need to pressure our politicians to get them to pressure the Israeli politicians, and it can work. We saw with Syria last year, David Cameron made a really big push to legitimise the bombing, which he did anyway. But there was one point where the British people resoundingly said no. And so as much as politicians, they follow the whip, they follow the people that vote them in more.
I believe that the British government has a huge responsibility to get involved. We have to remember Israel was created by the British government, not by the American government, not by some Jewish organisation here. It was the British government that gave this mandate and actually created Israel. So every crime that Israel commits is also a crime of Britain. And with the US funding it, every crime that Israel commits is a crime of the US, which was created by Britain, so it comes even further back to Britain, is the source of this trouble. So Britain has a responsibility to do something about this. The main thing that they can do, I would say, is sanctions, to basically ban businesses in Britain from being able to bring in any Israeli products, any products that are linked, like Coca-Cola, shouldn't be allowed until they break off links with Israel. But other than that, I think the British people have to be very careful that we don't get into this white saviour syndrome of not understanding that only the Arabs of the region are going to liberate Palestine. We are not going to liberate it. We can help and do our part, and that mainly our job as people living in the West is to make sure that the West stays out of helping Israel, does not fund Israel. That is our job. Anything else really in thinking to go over there and start teaching Palestinians this and thing is not our job. It's not our place. It's not, we don't have the right to go to that country and tell them how to fight their struggle.
Over 500,000 Israelis live in over 230 settlements, all illegal, built since the 1967 occupation of the West Bank. Israel plans even more settlements, forcing Palestinians from their land and blocking Gazans from importing cement to rebuild their homes after Israel's savage bombardments. More people than ever want the UK government to intervene. Meanwhile, Israel remains free to act, regardless of the damage to thousands of Palestinian families and the flaunting of international law.